Welcome to The Story. I'm David Molko in for Pat Doris tonight. For the last 5 years, the Oregon Board of Forestry has been working on a plan for how to manage state forests in Western Oregon. The crux of that debate might feel a little familiar. Environmental groups argue that more land should be set aside for endangered species. Meanwhile, timber interests say cuts to timber will cost jobs and create other problems for rural communities. It turns out there is a lot at stake this very week, and that is our big story. So we're not talking the next year, even the next decade, but the future of what can and cannot be cut down in some of Oregon state forests for the next 7 decades. All right, now we can see the forest for the trees. And as that picture comes into sharp focus here, so does a key vote that takes place tomorrow. Environmental reporter Cale Williams explains.
No one's going to be particularly happy, but that's what compromise is all about.
That's Jim Kelly, chair of the Oregon Board of Forestry, and he's been working on a plan for state forests in Western Oregon for the last 6 years. The Habitat Conservation Plan would set policy for roughly 700,000 acres of state forest, mostly in Tillamook and Clatsop counties, for the next 70 years. And when Kelly says that nobody's happy with the plan, he's not wrong. Among them, Tillamook County Commissioner David Yamamoto.
We do object strenuously to the way this particular habitat conservation plan was developed.
The plan, which is still in draft form, would set aside certain areas to protect endangered species like the northern spotted owl, the marbled murrelet, and coho salmon. In doing so, it would also drastically reduce the area available for timber harvest in the Coast Range, in some cases by as much as 35%.
Those are going to be devastating to the trust counties.
And to know why drops in timber harvest would be so bad for places like Tillamook County, you have to go back to the 1930s. That's when the Tillamook burn, a series of fires that burned for nearly 2 decades, scorched more than 500,000 acres in the county. After the fires, much of the land was granted to the state, forming what is now the Tillamook State Forest, after the state agreed to return 2/3 of the timber revenue to those counties. Fast forward to today, and timber revenue has become integral to how Tillamook County operates.
In Tillamook County, almost a quarter of our general fund revenue comes from state forest land timber harvest.
Over the years, as the state has sold off parcels for logging, they've been hit with numerous lawsuits arguing that the sales violate the Endangered Species Act, which forbids the destruction of habitat for endangered species. So in 2018, the Board of Forestry began coming up with a habitat conservation plan.
A landowner essentially makes a plan and says, if we do this, this, and this, then the federal government says, if you are doing all those things that will help conservation and help those species in general, then you're fine. We're not going to be, you're going to be protected from lawsuits.
We've just entered one of those upland areas where the trees in...
And that was welcome news to people like Casey Kulla, the state forest policy coordinator with Oregon Wild.
Branches all the way up on these old trees is what is habitat for red tree voles and for northern spotted owls and for marbled murrelets, because they need those big branches that are covered in moss. In 70 years, we're going to need habitat for all kinds of critters here, especially with climate change.
Kulla said protecting areas for endangered species makes sense, not just to avoid lawsuits, but because northwestern Oregon has already seen its fair share of heavy logging.
If we think about this as an investment that we all kind of own together and manage together, and we've used the profit more than we should, and animals are suffering because of it.
But for those who work in timber, the Habitat Conservation Plan represents a very real threat to their livelihoods.
Without a doubt, our biggest concerns with the HCP as it stands currently is the drastic reduction in timber harvest.
Chris Edwards, president of the Oregon Forest Industries Council, said the plan would hurt in more ways than one.
Certainly going to cost hundreds of jobs, and at a time when you're really decimating the job base, increasing the dependency on critical social services at a time where you're also undercutting the source of funding for those social services.
And those social services, they're high on the list of Yamamoto's concerns too.
All the departments within the counties, as well as the sheriff's office. So for life, health, safety issues, fire and rescue issues, ambulance service, schools, things of that nature. these are areas that are going to be hit very, very hard.
So you see this green layer in there.
Kula, who formerly served as a commissioner in Yamhill County, said Yamamoto's worries aren't completely misplaced.
Commissioner Yamamoto cares deeply about his place, and like him, I understand how county budgets work, and I know that other money can be found to replace that revenue because we don't have another Oregon state forest.
Between 2010 and 2020, a yearly average of 285 million board feet of timber were harvested from the forest that would be covered by the plan. The most recent estimates of what that number would be if the plan is passed, between 165 and 185 million board feet, a drop of between 35 to 40%. And when Kelly saw those numbers, he decided to introduce a resolution that, if passed, would modify the plan to increase timber harvest, though not by much. And that has put Yamamoto in a difficult position.
We don't want to be in a position where the department nor the Board of Forestry think that because of this proposed resolution that we are now in full support of the habitat conservation plan.
While the vote on the resolution will happen in public view at the board's meeting on Thursday, if it passes, the changes would be implemented behind closed doors with no public input. And that brings up just about the only thing that both sides agree on.
In Oregon, I think that we make our best decisions when we wrestle with them in a public view.
They're just trying to get this off their plate as quickly as possible because it's a political hot potato for them.
For his part, Kelly argues that the changes to the plan will be small enough that having a public hearing is not necessary. Though he did say he was committed to hearing from both sides.
Because you have all these people making heartfelt testimony about what this means for their family logging company, what this means for their community, what this means for the school. And then, you've got equally passionate people, equally right around many of the issues relative to conservation.
Ultimately, though, it's not the timber industry, the counties, or the conservation groups that Kelly said the board answers to.
We are answering to all Oregonians, and we are answering to future Oregonians, as well as to all of the species and our duty to do well by our environment.
Answering to all Oregonians. I mean, Kayla, it feels a little bit like Jim Kelly is talking out of both sides of his mouth here. Why not hold public hearings? Why not seek as much input as possible?
Well, I think that the timber industry groups and the environmentalists would probably agree with you there. I think that what Jim Kelly told me is that the changes to this plan are so small, he's really tinkering around the edges, that it really doesn't require another public hearing. And I got the feeling from him that after 6 years, they really just want to get this thing across the finish line.
Okay, you mentioned a drop in timber harvest here under this plan, something like 40%. I know they said small, but I guess small might be in the eye of the beholder here. What does that mean for Tillamook County? Where would they actually get the revenue?
Well, yeah, you heard it from Commissioner Yamamoto. They get a quarter of their general fund from timber harvest revenue. So I reached out to Governor Kotek's office and asked, what can be done? And they said they are looking for some alternative sources of revenue, but it was short on details. They didn't tell me how much or where it would come from.
Looking for alternative sources. All right, they're voting on the smaller resolution tomorrow on Thursday. What about the full plan?
Well, whether or not this resolution passes, this plan will still have to be approved by the federal agencies that oversee endangered species protections. And whether or not they approve that is still up in the air, but assuming they do, could be implemented as soon as next year.
Changes for the next 70 years there. Thank you, Cale.
My pleasure.
Well, we have some new information this evening now about a horrific attack police say was racially motivated. We were talking about the man accused of stabbing 2 teenagers on a MAX train over the weekend. Adrian Cummins is now charged with attempted murder, assault, and bias crime. Now, it turns out prosecutors say Cummins should have been in jail at the very time of that attack, though we've learned he was turned away and released despite a judge's order to keep him in custody. Investigative reporter Evan Watson went to try to squeeze some answers at what appears to be a gap in our system.
This is Adrian Cummins in court Tuesday. He's currently being held in jail accused of a dangerous attack at a MAX station on Saturday. But earlier in August, Portland police arrested Cummins. He had an outstanding warrant for failing to show up to court on charges of menacing with a knife. That happened earlier this summer. A judge ordered that Cummins needed to be held in jail until a hearing in late September. A police officer brought him to the jail, but jail officials and Corrections Health denied booking him. After KGW pressed for answers as to why Cummins wasn't held, a Multnomah County Sheriff's Office spokesman said on Wednesday that Cummins wasn't held in jail because of health or medical reasons. The spokesman did say health reasons are the most common example someone would be denied booking. Corrections Health makes that decision. Then a person might be taken to the hospital for treatment or released with a citation. Portland police say in this case, an officer gave Cummins a citation before releasing him. The officer's report says Cummins' condition was not an acute medical condition, but something that could be shared with other inmates if he was booked in a closed environment like a jail. PPV says giving a citation when someone can't be booked is common because it's time-consuming to have an officer supervise someone at a hospital before bringing them back to the jail for booking. We still don't know if this is common practice even when a judge orders someone held in jail who may be a risk to the public. In this case, Cummins was released from custody and is now accused of robbing a store, stabbing 2 boys in a racially motivated attack, and running from police.
And Evan's here now. I mean, Evan, great you were able to get some clarity here, though there's still one outstanding question. The court actually wanted Cummins held. That did not happen. Isn't the system designed to keep somebody accused of violent crimes, even if they have health issues, in custody?
You would think so, right? At least in theory.
Right.
But in practice, I did talk to Portland police just 30 minutes ago who said, when looking at this system and how it works, that often you'll write that citation because it takes too long to go to the hospital and wait and then bring someone back to the jail. But the question here is kind of the legal standard. Are there different types of holds coming from a judge that one would be looking at, that when you're looking at the judicial hold, that they would say, hey, for no reason this person should be released to the public versus a citation is okay in this case? The Portland police spokesperson I talked to said, in practice, we just deal with what's on the ground. You have to check it more into that. So that's what I get to follow up.
Right. As with most things, it's a gray area here.
Yeah.
All right. You had quite the day. How challenging was it to get all of these answers between the police and the sheriff's office and the DA?
I've got conflicting information at some times. It was a very interesting day of trying to get to those answers. I will say this is one of those cases where each individual agency said, hey, we're only involved in this part of it, but you'd have to ask that one for this part of it. And in any case like this, David, when there's some kind of accountability or responsibility, no one wants to take that full responsibility of the whole situation, but still needed questions here that we need to get answers to.
Right, of course. On a much more serious note here, the 2 17-year-olds, the 2 teenagers who were stabbed, how are they doing? What happens next here?
It was initially reported as non-life-threatening injuries, and since then we've learned more about the severity of that heart surgery they had to have. But as of now, we hear that they are recovering, and hopefully to hear great positive news on that to come. And the next steps here, we have a preventative detention hearing for the alleged suspect tomorrow, as the prosecutors want to make sure he is not released this time around. So we'll see what happens tomorrow morning.
All right, Evan, appreciate you digging into that. Thanks so much.
Thanks, David.
I'm Blair Best, live outside Portland City Hall, where City Council just unanimously voted to ban the public use of hard drugs. But there's a catch. It's not enforceable, likely for several months. We'll explain why when the story returns.
Welcome back. Last week here on The Story, we told you about the new plan to ban open-air drug use in the city of Portland. Well, that plan went before City Council this afternoon, who passed it unanimously. This ordinance expands the city law that makes it illegal to drink alcohol in public to include using drugs in public. In theory, violators could be fined as much as $500 or get 6 months in jail or both. So will police start handing out tickets and jailing people for smoking fentanyl on the sidewalk? Not so fast. If you remember our segment from last Thursday, there is a state law standing in the way of enforcing a ban just like this. It was passed in '71 to deal with public drunkenness, forbidding local governments from creating ordinances that penalize drinking in public, except in specific locations. So what ended up happening is cities banned drinking on streets, sidewalks, and public rights of ways. That law was amended then in '77 to include drugs, forbidding cities from criminalizing being high in public, though in that case there were no carve-outs for any locations because possession of hard drugs, again back in the '70s, was illegal, so it was all kind of a moot point there. But then of course 2020 Measure 110 comes along and we find ourselves where we are today. Council passing a ban on open-air drug use with no ability to enforce it. That power is going to have to come from state lawmakers during the short session next year, or perhaps something out of a court challenge, though at the moment there is no indication the courts are getting involved. Let's bring in Blair Best now live at City Hall. Blair, busy day for you. You were there for the testimony, the vote. Did anybody, we're talking members of the public, actually come out against this?
Well, David, while it may be a surprise to some people, there are people who live and work downtown Portland who oppose this type of ban. They argue that it's harmful to criminalize addiction. Now, this is the same argument that we heard several months ago when the camping ban passed. And these people are advocating for more addiction services and less penalties.
And you know what? Speaking of the need for recovery services, we've heard a lot of talk about that. You've covered a lot of those types of stories. What does the ordinance actually say when it comes to adding services potentially?
So this ordinance is calling on county and state leaders to work together to provide recovery services here in Portland. A big talking point today was the need for a sobering center, a place in downtown Portland where first responders can bring people who are highly intoxicated while they wait for a detox bed to open up. Commissioner Gonzalez today was saying this is a huge gap that needs to be filled.
I believe the county had one many years ago. Blair, this, as with many things when it comes to politics and bureaucracy, it's not black and white. That includes the legalities here. I mean, we tried to lay it out, but some might still call it confusing. I'm really curious to know, what did the commissioners make of that?
Honestly, David, it's incredibly confusing, and there was a lengthy discussion today around the legalities of enforcing a ban like this. Commissioner Mingus Mapps asked every single person who testified today several follow-up questions, and I think right before they decided to vote on this, he said this whole thing was clear as mud to him. But all that aside, what is clear here is that City Council is using this ordinance to send a message to Portlanders, to send a message saying they don't want people coming to Portland to use drugs.
Yeah, and those sirens behind you perhaps sending a message as well of how bad change and improvement is needed. Clear as mud, though. What a way to end that story today. Thank you, Blair. Still to come on The Story. It's not a bird, it's not a plane, but it got you flooding our newsroom with calls and emails asking just that. What in the world? Next. Well, did you happen to catch that thing floating over Portland this morning? Our newsroom was flooded with calls and emails. Lots of people wanting to know what the heck this was, especially after the Chinese weather, aka spy balloon, that grabbed the nation's attention at the beginning of the year. So first we contacted the National Weather Service. They said it was not theirs. Then we reached out to the military and the Port of Portland. Look at the jet going there. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, known as NOAA, no dice. Then our team remembered a story we covered back in February. A company out of Tillamook called Near Space Corporation. They work with NASA as well as the European Space Agency by sending balloons high into the atmosphere for research. So we called them, and sure enough, it was theirs. They launched it this morning from the Tillamook Airport.
It's a scientific research balloon. They're used to do different types of science experimentation in the atmosphere above where aircraft can fly. So most aircraft aren't going any higher than 40 or 50,000 feet. FAA controlled airspace ends at 60. Today's flight and where people saw that balloon was at 100,000 feet altitude. So it's up there a long ways.
100,000 feet above the earth. Yeah, way above the plates there. 19 miles up. That means it had to have been pretty big for so many people to be able to spot it on the ground. It was. The balloon, turns out, is about 150 feet, like a 15-story building. Tucker told us the conditions to spot it also happened to be perfect.
And then with the angle to the sun and the time of day today, it glinted really well. So yeah, it made it very, very visible to people on that side. If they'd been to the west of it, it would not have been quite as visible.
Well, Tucker says Near Space launches these balloon flights about once a month. Today's flight was to gather data for NASA on atmospheric conditions. They also got a lot of publicity out of it. If you want to learn more, check out our story on Near Space Corporation from this past February. Just search Near Space Corporation on KGW.com or on our KGW YouTube channel. Well, on Tuesday's show, we brought you some incredible footage from the KGW vault of the late Jimmy Buffett. I mean, he was no stranger to Portland, with shows here that stretched through the decades. Back in '92, he even arrived via seaplane on the Willamette. So we asked you for some of your favorite Margaritaville memories, and as usual, you did not disappoint.
I don't even remember what year it was, but we parked away from Portland and got on the MAX train to go to a Jimmy Buffett concert. And everyone on that train was a parrot head. Everyone was dressed up, Hawaiian shirts, fins, Hawaiian gear. It was so fun, such a party atmosphere, and we just had a blast. It was just the greatest concert. A smile all night long. He will certainly be missed.
Lorna, thanks for that message. We also heard from Amy, who wrote in to say Jimmy Buffett performed at a little club in downtown Portland in the summer of '75. My then boyfriend, later husband, and I went to his show. We arrived very early, and he and his band were rehearsing sweet musical memories of a wonderful person gone too soon. Thanks so much for sharing, Amy. Last night, we apparently promised some extra credit to those of you who gave us a little karaoke. Honestly, I am not sure that was such a good idea, though a viewer named Casey came the closest to performing via voicemail. Thank you, Casey. I think we're going to end with this.
Years ago, I had a chance to work security one time at a concert. I ended up standing on stage just to the left of Jimmy Buffett at the Moda Center, I think. And it was amazing. Very sweet man, very great show. And yes, he was a pirate, born 200 years too late. We miss you, Jimmy.
Yes, we do. Casey, that was very poetic. We appreciate you leaving that for us. He will be missed. That does it for the story this Wednesday. We got a quick programming note here. NFL football here on KGW preempts most of our news lineup on Thursday. The Story and Pat Doris will return on Friday. Stick around for the good stuff next. We're talking about that movement towards used instead of new, and a retail giant, an outdoor retail giant, getting into the game right here in the Portland area. Before we go there, how about a look from Cannon Beach? A beautiful evening. I know the sunset is creeping earlier and earlier, but you know what? It's still officially summer, so let's get out there, let's soak it up, let's enjoy it as long as it lasts. My name's David Molko. Thank you for watching. I'll be back tonight at 11 with your headlines. If I do not see you then, thanks for watching. Have a great night, everybody.